Good evening.
Oh, there it is.
Good evening.
Derek, go for it.
Oh, okay. We're going right into
Recording in progress.
it. Okay, so good evening and welcome, everybody. My name is Derek Montgomery, and I am a community engagement specialist with the Leon County Department of Health. I really want to extend a very heartfelt thank you to First Lady Ward of the Metropolitan Cathedral of Truth for inviting me to be here today to talk about what is a really, really important topic, especially in our community today. And so, not particularly surprisingly, especially coming from the health department, we're going to spend pretty much the entirety of the presentation on COVID-19, dispelling a couple of myths, giving some basic facts about COVID-19, methods of prevention, methods to keep yourself safe, and then, of course, the vaccine. Just so that you all are aware, my general premise in coming up with this presentation is that I really want to make sure that we're sort of starting that everything that we build on is absolutely clear. Sort of in my mind, I have this image of coming up on a desert island of people who've never heard of COVID-19 and are wondering, what's this thing all about? And so some of the things you might have heard before, some of the things you might think, oh, of course that's the case. Who else would not know that? But do be aware that all of these pertain to questions that we have gotten in the past, and so we don't necessarily want to assume anything because some of you know what happens when we assume, unfortunately. So the title of our COVID-19 class is To Know the Facts. So starting from the top, COVID-19 is a disease caused by a virus. This is a respiratory disease that can cause really severe lung damage and, unfortunately, for a lot of people in our community, death. The way that they came up with this name, it wasn't sort of made out of whole cloth. It was actually a particularly uncreative way of coming up with the name. The CO out of COVID stands for corona, essentially the type of virus that we're dealing with. The VI, as you might be able to guess, stands for virus. So corona, virus, and because this is a disease, we have the end of the D, which is where we get the term COVID. The first discovered case of this disease was in 2019, hence the name COVID-19. So you can imagine that if we got this sort of disease in 2020, 2021, it would sort of be referred to as COVID-21, simply to refer to the year in which we had our first case. Now, as the slide says, the COVID-19 started kind of developing around December. There's a chance that it might have sort of crept up a little bit. However, we don't necessarily have any documentation of these cases before December, and so that's what we kind of use as our launch date. So just a little bit of facts about viruses. I know that some people get a little bit confused when we're talking about a viral infection versus a bacterial infection. Probably the simplest way to note the difference is that bacteria can actually be sort of alleviated through antibacterial medicine. So this is a living organism that can actually be killed. The virus is a little bit different. So the virus is not necessarily a living organism, and it's much smaller than any bacteria that we come in contact with. Just to kind of put it in perspective, about 500 million viruses can fit simply on the head of a pin. It's quite a lot. And so when we talk about the potential for you to come in contact with the virus, just be aware that if we're talking 500 million viruses on the head of a pin, you can imagine what comes out in the sneeze. So viruses are made up of genetic material. Usually they're made out of RNA, but sometimes they're made out of DNA, and I'll get a little bit into the specifics about the differences a little bit later in this program. And this sort of RNA material is just sort of the message that essentially tells your body it's time to get sick. And so this is surrounded by a protective coating, which also on the outside of it has a few little spikes on it. There are millions of different types of viruses, and they can be found all over the world. And new viruses are kind of coming online every day, as you all might be aware. So pictured here, we actually have a picture of the coronavirus sort of taken over an electron microscope. Kind of as we describe, if you all can see my cursor, We have this sort of outer shell here that protects the RNA or the DNA that's inside the virus that codes for the actual disease. And then over here, you have these kind of like red, sort of like spiky looking things. And these things actually attach to the cells in order to input the genetic material. So it's kind of like if you ever seen like some of those old pirate movies when they sort of lower the plank down on the other ship so that all the pirates. That's generally what these spikes are used for in the context of this virus. Next slide. So the reason why we call it a coronavirus is corona is a sort of a fancy Latin term for crown, which, as you can see in the picture, we have quite a few sort of like crown-ish looking spikes on the side, which is where we. Coronavirus is a family of hundreds of types of viruses. So you might have heard coronavirus probably many, many years ago to refer to the common cold. This is the same type of virus, but not necessarily the virus that we're talking about today. So some people might have heard things like the COVID-19 is essentially a cold virus. They're about family, however, it's not the same virus, and there's a pretty drastic difference between the two that we'll get into a little bit later. So some coronaviruses, as we said, cause common cold. Some of them cause SARS. Some of them cause MERS, which is something that a lot of us are vaccinated for at a pretty young age. And it can also cause diseases in other animals. There's a lot of sort of scientific study and investigation going into. And originally, the idea was that there was sort of some kind of wet market in China, a lot of distressed animals, and that it was very, very likely that it came from a bat that transferred over into a human. There's still a lot of studies to try to determine the effectiveness of that. So what we'll just say is that this is a disease that can transfer from, not particularly likely, but it can happen. COVID-19, the primary way that it's transmitted, this is sort of the one thing that everybody wants to know is like, okay, well, now that I know what coronavirus is, how do I get it? Not particularly the thing that you want to get. So this is usually done by a person-to-person transmission, usually through breathing. So what happens is that we have sort of like water particulates in our lungs, and each one of those water particulates contains probably tens and tens of billions of viruses. And so that every time we speak, we don't necessarily see it, but little microscopic water droplets are sort of escaping our mouths. This is a little bit more pronounced with people who spit a lot when they're talking, you might know. But with each one of those breaths, a lot of virus ends up getting put out into the atmosphere. And as you come into contact with that virus, you end up breathing it in, and presto, now you have a viral infection of the Corona-19 virus. So this can be transferred either through mouth, by nose, by throat. This is part of the reason why pretty early on in the coronavirus pandemic, you heard a lot about not touching your face. We're really concerned about people sort of touching surfaces that were infected with the coronavirus and then essentially wiping the virus into their eyes. So part of how you can sort of defend against that is by hands, also not touching sort of like your face and things like that. A couple of other ways the virus is transmitted: talking, laughing, of course, coughing and sneezing. And what we found, especially among musicians and choirs and things like that, is through singing. So it's basically on an increased scale that you see here. So talking emits a little bit of virus, laughing more, coughing much more, and then we get up to sneezing aloud, singing, and all of a sudden we've just got like a viral party going on. So it's really, really important, I think, for you all to sort of generally know how this kind of thing is spread so that you know what mitigation methods to take in the future. Now, as I said before, you can come into contact with the virus on the surface. Thankfully, we've had a lot of research put into this, and we found that the virus doesn't live very long on surfaces. If you were to sneeze, say, on a bench that happened to be out in the sun kills pretty quickly, basically within 15 to 30 seconds. So you're pretty safe under those categories. A little bit longer to dissipate. And so there is a potential for you to sort of touch a surface and then potentially touch part of your body that could absorb the virus. So really, really important that you're constantly washing your hands so that you don't have any virus on your hands. And then avoid touching your eyes, your mouth, your nose, essentially any orifice that would allow you to inhale or otherwise. So when you get the coronavirus, it's not like, oh my gosh, I've been infected, I'm immediately sick. There's a little bit of what we call an incubation. So an incubation period from an exposure, this kind of symptom usually shows up within the first 2 to 14 days. So if you've been around somebody who is sick, it's only been, say, like a day or two, chances are if you were to get tested that day, you might actually test negative because the virus hasn't had enough time to build up in your system. So one of the things that we recommend is that we wait a little bit from the date of exposure. Say if you went to a particular person's house or a party or what have you on a Sunday, probably waiting until Monday for you to get that test is going to be the best way to make sure that you're getting the most accurate results possible. I know the last thing that I would want, and I imagine the last thing that any of you all would want, is to sort of get the green card of, oh, good, I'm negative after sort of a day after exposure, and then end up contracting the virus and possibly making other. So what the incubation period does is that it really allows more of the virus to develop in your system. And so once the virus load gets to a certain point, that's about the point where you start experiencing the coughing, the sneezing, the headaches, and other symptoms like that. Now, it is possible, and we've noticed this especially with the younger population, although that is changing quite a bit now, is that people can be infected with the virus without showing any symptoms. Other diseases that kind of match along these lines, you know about HIV, these types of things where the virus can still spread. However, the person that you're getting it from doesn't have any symptoms of coughing, sneezing. They look well, but they have a pretty high viral load, and through talking, speaking, singing, or any of the other methods that we talked about before, could still spread the virus to other people. So 97.5% of people, however, do have symptoms within 12 days, even if they're super duper mild. And a lot of people, especially if you're younger or you have a particularly robust immune system, might not notice it. You might just think, wow, I'm a little tired today. That's weird. And that is very much a symptom of coronavirus. Or a lot of people that we've encountered have said, well, you know, my allergies are really acting up. So I'm sneezing a lot, I'm coughing a lot. It must be the pollen. To that, I would say it very might well be, but you're definitely going to want to be sure by getting a test, which thankfully we have free and available in locations around the county. Be happy to get to that a little bit later as well. If we're talking about the infectious period for the virus, people are usually infectious 2 to 3 days before they show disease symptoms. So if you think about this sort of as a clock, that we have sort of 2 to 14 days before you show symptoms, and before that period is a period where you can still be infectious. These are usually our asymptomatic cases or cases of people who or might attribute the symptoms to something else. Again, like we were talking about before, you might just sort of contribute being tired to sort of the lows of that day, where it very well could be the coronavirus that's the disease end period is when all of the symptoms have gone away. So usually about 14 days after you've contracted the virus, most of your symptoms should be gone, except in some of the cases where people might experience a little bit more fatigue, kind of extended tiredness, or there might be damage to the throat that causes extended coughing and sneezing. After the symptoms resolve, a diagnostic test. And so some of the COVID-19 tests that we have over at FAMU, if any of you all have ever been to the testing site there or any of the other testing sites that we have around Leon County, because there still is virus in your system, even after you get over a COVID-19 infection, it's quite likely that you'll continue to test positive for about the next 2 to 4 weeks. The reason for that is, again, like we were talking about before, we've got 500 million viruses simply on the head of a pin. And now we're talking about a bloodstream. So you can imagine that it's tens and tens of billions more, possibly going into the hundreds of. Well, it takes quite a while for all of that virus to leave your system. Now, during this period, after sort of like the 14 days from the point that you were infected, you're no longer infectious to others. So even though you might still test positive for a coronavirus test, you're no longer a danger to other people, nor should you have any symptoms at this point. Usually one of the things that we recommend, especially for people who are doing sort of contact tracing, self-isolation, self-quarantine, anything along those lines, is that once you contract the disease, 14 days later, you are free to resume all activity. There are some people who say, well, I still don't have my taste and smell. Are you sure I'm not going to be infecting other people? Thankfully, we've put quite a lot of research into this, and we are pretty confident in saying that no, you will not. You might still get a side eye from somebody if you're coughing and sneezing next to them, but that's a whole other case. So, a little bit about contact tracing. If any of you have come down with the coronavirus or know somebody who has, you've probably gotten a little surprise call from one of our contact tracers. So contact tracing is the process of notifying those who have unknowingly been in close contact with someone who has a positive case of coronavirus. So that's a big fancy way of saying is that essentially when somebody comes down with the coronavirus, we give them a call, ask them who they've been around sort of within the last 3 to 5 days to try to get a sense of how the disease has spread. And they give us a list of names, and we sort of go into contact mode to try to make sure that everybody in that social group knows that they have come in contact with this virus so that they can make the responsible decisions of self-isolation and self-quarantine in order to mitigate the spread until they get a test. So contact to a positive case, which the test is negative, we recommend that they self-quarantine for 10 days. So this is somebody who was tested negative but was still around somebody with the coronavirus. We still recommend that you self-quarantine for 10 days. The reason being is that even though you don't necessarily have a positive test, even though you don't necessarily show symptoms, if you're within that first sort of 1 to 3 days of the contact point from the virus, you could still be infectious to others, or you could just not know that you have the virus and it's still building up in your system enough so that we can detect it on a test. I hope that makes sense. If not, we'll definitely get that in the question and answer period. So contacts to a case who do test positive, we recommend that they self-isolate for 14 days. And the reason for that is that you've come down with the coronavirus, we have a positive test, we're absolutely sure that we do have it, and 14 days is the amount of time that it takes for you to not be infectious anymore. So essentially, you're no longer spreading the virus to it. So a little bit of a difference, because I know this gets a little bit confusing, and we get this a lot, especially with people who are wondering, okay, self-quarantine versus self-isolation, what's really the difference? It really is just sort of a matter of degree. So as you can see here, we have a couple of recommendations that we have for people who are either self-quarantining or self-isolating. But the biggest difference is going to be time. So if you're self-quarantining, this is somebody who is tested negative for the coronavirus, but has been in contact with somebody who is positive. In those cases, just to be absolutely sure that you don't have a virus that's building up in your system so that we can notice it on a test later, we ask for you to quarantine yourself for 10 days just to be able to mitigate that risk. Self-isolation, however, refers to people who are already positive for the coronavirus. So they come into contact with somebody, they've gone and gotten a test, and now they've gotten confirmation that they're sick. For them, we recommend 14 days of self-isolation to make absolutely certain that you don't have symptoms and that you're well past your infectious period of being able to spread this disease to other people.
Derek, can I just interrupt you for just a little bit? At different points, your voice is going out. I don't know if it's the way you're moving and your Wi-Fi, but if you could just stay still just a little bit and keep your head straight, because it's going in and out and it's making it difficult for some of us to hear, okay?
Okay, sorry about that. Can you all hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. I'll try not to move as much. So, just a little bit of a quick review. A person should self quarantine if they were near someone who tested positive for the coronavirus and they test negative for COVID-19. A person should self isolate if they have COVID-19 symptoms and test positive for the disease. So, just to kind of button up that issue, those are the main differences between what we call self quarantine versus self isolation. So, some of the symptoms you all might be familiar with when it comes to COVID-19 include fever, chills, cough, shortness of breath. A lot of people report feeling fatigued, especially for long periods of time. And some people have even experienced some nausea, vomiting, or unfortunately diarrhea as a result of the coronavirus infection. Remember, though, that you can still be infectious days before you develop these symptoms. So, just because you're not experiencing the symptoms does not necessarily mean that you're not capable of spreading the virus. In fact, it's usually during this period that most of the virus ends up spreading. So, a bit into some of the long-term effects. Like we said earlier, 14 days is usually the period of time where it takes most of your symptoms to go away. However, because the COVID-19 virus is a disease that attacks a lot of different parts of your body, especially the lungs, the heart, and the kidneys as well, there can be long-term damage as a result of symptoms from having this disease. As we discussed a little bit before, those symptoms can also include fatigue. They can include a continued shortness of breath if there's a lot of damage to the lungs. Kind of the same deal when we talk about coughing, chest pain, muscle pain. Usually these are associated with people who have been coughing a lot, and the muscles are quite from this kind of infection. There can also be sort of mental effects as a result of having coronavirus, especially since we're in a period where a lot of people are having to sort of stay away from other people, sort of not be nearly as social as a lot of us are used to. That can really weigh on the mind. And so a lot of people end up with depression after having come down with the disease and other sort of mental health challenges that do need to be addressed. Some of the some of the long-term effects that are less likely to happen but still do appear are some neurological effects. There's actually some research now that gives some kind of indication that the loss in taste of smell is actually due to a neurological issue that's caused by the virus. So some pretty scary stuff there. We're still trying to get our hands around what exactly causes what, but do be aware that these are some of the long-term effects that you can expect, especially if you are in. Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. So there are a couple of risks, pre-existing risks when it comes to coronavirus. Because this is a disease that attacks the heart and lungs particularly, people who already have weaknesses in those areas are much, much, much more likely to have a severe reaction than somebody who was sort of younger, healthier, and maybe had a robust immune system without any sort of pre-existing conditions. Kind of in order here, diabetes, heart disease, weakened immune systems, usually due to some sort of autoimmune disease or HIV/AIDS, lung disease, people who smoke for long periods of time. Pretty much anything that does damage to your lungs is going to put you a little bit behind the race when it comes to the that very, very, very much likes to attack lungs, hearts. Some other pre-existing conditions that might put you at risk also include cancer, liver disease, kidney disease, and part of that is because usually people who have those diseases or taking medicines end up weakening their immune systems. So if you have cancer and you're on a chemo regimen, your immune system is going to be pretty weak. So if you come in contact with the coronavirus and you already have a weakened immune system, again, the coronavirus is getting a So some people have sort of asked us, well, what's the big deal? How many people are really dying from COVID? Unfortunately, in the last year, it's actually ticked up quite a bit. So it used to be that the main killers of people in America were heart disease, cancer, stroke, sort of unintended injuries, people who go skydiving and other crazy things like that. But coronavirus has actually jumped up to number 3. So right now, not even necessarily talking about African Americans, Black people, which we'll definitely get into later, but just Americans in general, it's the number 3 killer in the US right now. So it's really, really important that we take this virus seriously, that we enact as many of the preventive measures as we can and know as much as we can about. As I said before, this is the 3rd leading cause of death, only behind heart disease and cancer in the US. To date, we've had over 345,000 people die, and this research was taken a couple of months ago, so we're well over 500,000 at this point. And it's been estimated that within the US, about, at the very least, 900,000 people are going to lose their lives as a result of this disease, which is a tragedy of absolute, just gargantuan proportions. Especially since now a lot of these deaths are absolutely preventable using some of the prevention measures we'll outline in a sec. So, speaking of African American people, I have a little chart here that explains a little bit about what we can expect when we come into. As you can see, if I bring the cursor over here to Black, African American, non-Hispanic people, and we just look at the case number, this 1.1 means that we are 1.1 times as likely as any other American, Caucasian, Hispanic, Latino, or otherwise, of coming into contact and contracting the disease. So basically, our chances of coming into contact and getting the disease is pretty much the same as our Caucasian counterparts. Unfortunately, that's where our similarities end, because we are almost 3 times as likely to end up in the hospital as a result of that. We are twice as likely to die. So just to put that into perspective, we're just as likely as anyone else to get the disease, 3 times as likely to go to the hospital, and twice as likely to die. Now, a lot of the reasons for this has to do with some of the conditions that are already happening in our community. I mentioned diabetes, which is something that has sort of a higher occurrence in our community. And so, again, if your immune system is already weak, you're kind of running a race from a little bit behind when it comes to the coronavirus. So just talking a little bit about some of the racial disparities that are leading to more of us dying of this disease, we are much more likely to be in essential work settings. This is custodians, these are grocery store workers, home health care workers, even nurses. We're really overrepresented in a lot of these sort of essential fields, and so we never got a chance to quarantine. We never got a chance to go back home and do everything on Zoom. We had to go right back out there in order to be able to pay our bills. So because of this, we had a lot more exposure to the virus. That on top of a lot of the sort of like ongoing diseases that are rampant in our community have sort of really ramped up the numbers of African Americans who are dying from this disease, which is part of the reason why it's so much more than any of the other races in America. Another one of the things that might contribute to the racial disparities are multi-generational households. So I know that I actually have one of these where my mom and grandmother live together, where we have multiple generations, people with different sets of immune systems living together in the same household who have the potential to be able to spread this to other people. Much more likely in the African American community and the Hispanic community than it necessarily is in the Caucasian. We also have a greater number of reporting by white persons. So usually they'll be the first in line to get a test. Now, thankfully, that's changing. And so all of the people who know that they have the coronavirus can operate with that information. So they can say, oh gosh, I'm infected, I need to stay home, I need to get this sort of medicine, and I'll be able to monitor those sorts of diseases. And again, as we were talking about before, some of the pre-existing conditions has a really big contributing factor when it comes to our racial disparity with respect, because we have a higher incidence of obesity, because we have a higher incidence of diabetes and high blood pressure and sort of other pre-existing conditions, all of these combined together bring us to a place where we're much more overly exposed to the coronavirus and more predisposed to experience some of the worst symptoms of it. Just want to check to make sure everybody can hear me. A couple of risk factors that can lead to death. Again, as we were talking about before, the coronavirus really attacks the lungs. And so to the extent that you're not able to use your lungs, you're not able to breathe. And unfortunately, if you can't breathe, you end up dying as a result of lack of oxygen, or what we call anoxia. So people with previous histories of heart attacks are also at an increased risk because the coronavirus attacks the heart. So if you've had heart attacks before, it's very likely that the coronavirus could trigger a heart attack within you as well, which would also be part of the reason that you die. Kidney failure, strokes, blood clotting disorders, all of these can stem from the COVID-19 disease. The reason being is that it attacks so many different parts of your body with such efficiency that sometimes you end up with organ failure, and then once an organ fails, especially if it's vital, sort of like the kidneys or the liver or stuff like that, there can be complications from that as well that can lead to death. So there are a lot of sort of ways to end up with the worst possible outcome of the COVID-19 virus. So just a couple of statistics here at the bottom as well. Those who are 65 to 75, especially towards the beginning of this, and this is more reflective of people who were not vaccinated, unfortunately, about 2 to 5% of those who contract the virus end up dying as a result. As you get older, that chance gets much higher. As you get to 75 and 85, that chance rises to about 4 to 10%. And then people who are over 85, what we've seen is, especially with those who are unvaccinated, that they're about 10% likely to die as a result of contracting this virus. So really scary stuff here. There's a couple of ways that people end up treating this. So some supportive care that you can do includes oxygen. Some people might have heard of people being on ventilators, which is essentially a tube that goes down your esophagus and into your lungs that breathes for you. You might have also heard of monoclonal antibodies. What essentially they've done is if they've gone to somebody who was sick, zapped a little bit of their blood, and extracted the antibodies. And after having done that, once they can inject you with those antibodies, then you have antibodies that can defend. So it's a little bit like a blood transfusion, except we're doing it with antibodies. So these things provide your body with the exact sorts of things that you need in order to fight off this virus, although it is still better if you never come into contact with it in the first place. We have a couple of ways of testing for the one is a molecular test swab. And so we've got two types of these. One is called a PCR test, which is incredibly accurate and goes just as incredibly far up your nose. Another one, which you might all be more familiar with, are the rapid tests, which go much less far up your nose, thankfully, and results are ready within minutes to about 24 hours, thankfully. Like we said before, you can still test positive on this swab even after you've experienced the coronavirus disease. So 14 days after you've contracted the disease, because there's so much dead virus still in your nose and your mouth and sort of throughout your body, the swab will be very likely to pick that up, but you can rest assured that you are no longer infectious and no longer a danger to anyone. Another type of test that we have is called the antibody test. So this is meant to see whether or not you have had COVID before. I've gotten a couple of these done, and they've all thankfully have come out negative. But what this will do is that if you believe that you might have come in contact with the virus before in the past, or if you just want to see if in the last 3 months, if you have potentially been asymptomatic or not showing, this test is a really, really good way to determine whether or not you already have those antibodies. If you do have the antibodies, that does mean that you have had COVID at least within the last 3 months. So, on to prevention. So, we've covered a lot about what the coronavirus is, what it does, and some of the sort of the scarier things that it does. So, now we're on to prevention. So, back in 1918, we had a pretty awful pandemic, Spanish flu. Um, Thankfully, I wasn't around for that. But the Spanish flu was a really devastating disease that wiped out a pretty sizable portion of the global population. It was essentially the last one of these that we had. We refer to coronavirus as sort of a once in 100-year event. So 100 years ago, the advice from all of the medical professionals was wear a mask, wash your hands, socially distance. Now, I was a little upset when I found that out because I thought, well, 100 years have passed, really? Like, technology hasn't gotten better? Like, it's still wash your hands, social distance, and wear a mask? Like, we haven't come up with anything better in the last 100 years? And one of the reasons why we haven't necessarily come up with anything better is because there is nothing better. There's nothing that's going to protect you more than having clean hands that will keep you from being able to inhale the virus on the off chance that you touch your face. Social distancing is the way for you to be far enough away from somebody who is to not breathe it in as they may be speaking, singing, laughing, or talking. And also, the mask is going to be something that will always both protect you and the person that you are is positive with the coronavirus and is wearing a mask, it is much less likely that they would be able to pass that on to other people. When we talk about social distancing, there's a couple of ways to think about this. One is, of course, the 6 feet of distance that we're all probably familiar with. The reason why I say at least is because that's going to be the very minimum of distance that you're going to want to have against somebody, especially if they're positive, excuse me, for the coronavirus, and especially if you're in an indoor setting. So one of the things that we recommend is that if you can, avoid crowded spaces, football games, offices, cubicles, essentially any kind of indoor space where virus. Thankfully, I don't do any of these things already, but sharing food, so buffet lines, things like that, where a lot of different people are touching the utensils that have access to the food, as well as restrooms and beds. Again, the virus doesn't live on a surface for very long, but there is some potential for you to be able to grab that virus from a surface and be infected as a result. So face mask is one of the more effective ways that we have of preventing this kind of spread because you're able to keep your germs to yourself, thankfully. So one of the things that's really important to note too, and we'll talk about vaccinations a little bit later, but even people who have been vaccinated, we're still recommending that you wear a mask. The reason being is that even though you might not necessarily contract the virus, even if you don't necessarily show symptoms or end up sick from the virus, if you're exposed, it still has the potential to multiply and you could still spread it to others, even if you're not particularly infected yourself. Again, we're talking about 500 million viruses simply on the head of a pin. So it really doesn't take very much to be able to infect someone. It only takes one. There's also a concern, and we'll get to this a little bit later with the variants as well, that might have an effect on some of the vaccines that we have. So here we have a little bit of a chart that kind of explains how masks work. I know a lot of people have been sort of wondering exactly how this sort of piece of cloth can protect me. So if we go to the top, we see, I'll just call her Susie, I guess. Susie over here is talking to, we'll call him Dave, and neither of them have a mask on. because neither of them have a mask on, there's absolutely nothing to keep the virus from spreading. And so it's very likely that if Susie over here is sick, there's a 90% chance Dave is going to end up sick as well. So if we go down a little bit, and now we've sort of changed the rules a little bit. So now the person who is being spoken to is wearing a mask, but the person who's speaking and is positive of the coronavirus is not. That mask will still protect you to a certain extent, but as you can see, it's not nearly as effective as if both of you are wearing a mask. If the person who's infected is wearing a mask and you're around them and you're not wearing a mask, there's only a 5% chance that you contract the virus. So we've gone from 90% if nobody's wearing a mask, 70% if you're wearing a mask and you're talking to somebody who's sick, down to 5% if the sick person wears the mask. And thankfully, if your number is almost at zero at 1.5%. There are a couple of routine activities that we talked about before. School and university settings are a big one. Crowded indoor spaces like restaurants, bars, buffets, unfortunately, churches. All of these have a sort of a moderate to high risk of having you come into contact with the. There are a couple of places that are a little bit less risky, but it's really important that you understand that the way that the virus spreads is through person-to-person around people, and there's not a whole lot of mask wearing going on, and there's no vaccination going on, and it's very likely that you might come in. Nursing homes, dorm rooms, multi-generational households, all of these kind of crowded spaces, prisons as well, are places where the coronavirus can spread because you don't have any social distancing, and very often you don't have any masks. I just have a little picture of the coronavirus. What you see here are the little spikes that we were talking about, and that they're actually latching onto a cell here in order to input the disease material into the cells so that your body can multiply it. This picture is going to be really important when we talk about how vaccines work. Move just a little bit here, just looking at the time. So, a couple of basic terms. When we talk about the mRNA vaccines, what we're talking about are the Pfizer and Moderna shots. So mRNA is very, very different from DNA, which is a double helix. The main thing to know about RNA is that it contains a message that codes into one of your cells. So it essentially tells your cell to do something. It's the equivalent of you sort of yelling across the room and telling somebody to grab the remote to change the channel on the TV. So spike proteins, when we talk about spike proteins, those are kind of what we were talking about before. Here it is. These little outside things that latch onto the cell itself. And finally, when we talk about antibodies, these are things that build up in your system that are designed to fight this specific virus. So it's really, really important that we have those if we're going to be able to defend ourselves against this virus.
Developing
Pfizer biotech vaccines, Moderna vaccines, both of these things are designed by taking a little piece of RNA and encasing it in what we call a lipid, or what happens is that the mRNA gets into your body and goes to the cells, much like the virus would, except in this case, we're not talking about a virus. Now, thankfully, what this message does is that it tells your cells to create that same little spike protein that we saw on some of the pictures earlier on the outside of the cell, so that your So basically, when we're talking about mRNA vaccines, we get a message in our body that tells our cells to create the outer shell of the vaccine. Once your body sees that outer shell, it goes into attack mode, and it knows what to do in case you actually come into contact with the much more dangerous coronavirus. A little thing about the symptoms that you can kind of expect. A lot of these antibodies are going to be You might have heard a little bit about getting a booster shot after an 8-month period. That's the main reason why, is that the antibodies do tend to go down after a period of time. So it's important to sort of refresh the immune system and give yourself another trial run, so that your body knows what to do if. Now, one thing that's really, really important to note is that mRNA is not DNA. It does not change your genetic material. You will not grow a third foot or a hoof or a unicorn horn or anything along those lines. This has no interaction to who you are. It's simply a message to is create an outer shell of the virus so that I can trick my body into thinking I have coronavirus so I don't actually have to get sick from it. Well, unfortunately, we have to skip that. So, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is another vaccine that is taken from essentially a dead virus. So this is more in lines with some of the viruses that you've had before, or excuse me, some of the vaccines that you might have had before for MERS, smallpox. Essentially what it does is it takes a little bit of what we call an adenovirus, not necessarily a coronavirus, but it makes it look like a coronavirus. So that your body sort of, again, gets tricked into thinking that you have the disease so that it can start fighting against it. It's a little bit of a different sort of technological way of approaching it. Whereas Pfizer and Moderna, they send the specific message to your cells to create the outer shell. Here, we have the outer shell kind of already created and that they inject into your body. And for that, we're recommending 1 dose, although there is a potential for boosters as more research comes in. Thankfully, in the development of these vaccines, even though they were done under what was termed Operation Warp Speed, there were no corners cut in the developing of any of these vaccines. So usually for any clinical trial, if we were to combine it all together, we could expect about 10,000 people to be involved. Here we've had over 70,000. So well, many times more than anybody than any vaccine that's ever been in development before that we've taken. There's really never been a vaccine on the planet that's more tested and that has been studied more for any kind of potential negative effects. So if you're wondering, well, I don't know about necessarily taking the vaccine, I don't think that enough people are taking it, you can feel confident that before the vaccine was even available, we've had 70,000 people who have gone through with virtually no problems, and now tens of millions of people who have taken the vaccine around the world who also are no longer experiencing issues. So some of the things that you can expect from the vaccine are some of the symptoms that you might expect with a regular cold. Although it's really important to know that when we're talking about side effects from a vaccine, is that it's not the disease itself. It's simply your body reacting to a foreign object. So if you end up infected with any kind of virus, essentially the virus has a head start as the enough antibodies to be able to effectively fight it. So under this case, the body does a lot of other different things to try to kill off a foreign object before it has time to spread. It might raise or lower the body temperature to try to kill it off. This is where you might experience fevers or chills after having gotten the vaccination. It'll also might have some swelling to try to make sure that it keeps that virus simply in one spot and doesn't allow it to spread. A lot of people have kind of talked about pain at the injection site of the arm, a little bit of swelling. All of those can be expected and are thankfully signs that the vaccine is working exactly the way that it's supposed to. So just a list of some of the things that you can expect for those of you who wanted to take a screenshot: dizziness and lightheadedness, a little bit of arm aching, soreness. These sorts of things are just a general immune response that your body goes into whenever there's a foreign object inside of it that it wants to get rid of. So the biggest takeaway from this is that all the symptoms related to the vaccine are normal defensive responses to your body. And it's really important to remember that you don't actually have the virus in your body, is that we've essentially tricked your body during this sort of trial drill to make sure that when the virus comes up, that it knows what to do. We do have a short video just to give you all a little bit of a diversity of the people who are talking about this, because I really think that it's important that we not only hear from experts, but we hear from experts who look like us talking about something that affects us so deeply. So here's a short video featuring some doctors talking about the vaccine. And it's important to remember that this was made before the vaccine came out and was available to the general public. By the time this video came out, it was only available to people over the age of 65.
Hello, Black America, and people who pay attention to what Black folks are doing. My name's W. Kamau Bell. There's good news out there. There's a COVID-19 vaccine. Yay! But the bad news is, as Black folks, it's hard to trust what's going on. So what do? Well, we turn to people we can trust, Black folks. But not just your uncle at the cookout. No. Actually, not him at all. I'm talking about Black scientists, Black doctors, and Black nurses. Okay, first question. The vaccine happened fast, like super fast, like Usain Bolt headed to the bathroom fast. Is that something we should be concerned about?
Having an emergency authorization for these medications was critical, but that doesn't mean any steps were cut.
Anything where money could be traded off for time, that was happening. Like, money was no object.
They still have all of the rigor that they use for approving any vaccine. So we can feel confident that the science is still there.
The messenger RNA technology has been in development for the last 12 years. So even though you hear this thing about warp speed, believe me, that was not warp speed.
And I think the data is real. It suggests it's highly effective.
About a week or so after your second dose, the people who had gotten the placebo or who didn't get the true vaccine, their rates of coronavirus continued to climb, whereas the people who had gotten the vaccine, it just flattened out.
And what about side effects?
Soreness from the injection site.
I had a little bit of arm soreness.
Arm sore? Is that a side effect? My arm's sore right now.
The common things, soreness at the injection site, headache, fever, maybe a swollen lymph nodes.
The second dose is when there's more common, those systemic side effects.
Is this like one of those pharmaceutical commercials where at the end they talk real fast about the side effects and it's like, you're also gonna get hair from your eyeballs and vampirism?
My sister texted me the second day after I got the first vaccine, and I remember she was like, "Are you a zombie yet?" And we just laughed, like, "No, I'm not."
So the big answer is no. And the reason being is we are not injecting the virus into your body. The vaccine is training your body.
It is making those antibodies to fight that disease. So I view it as a positive thing.
So here's a question from everybody's uncle, and since I'm an uncle, it's a question from me too. Are the drug companies just trying to get rich off this?
The drug companies will certainly get rich.
Oh, drug companies are always trying to get rich, but that's not the point, right?
That is really how a lot of our innovation happens. That is why the drug companies will spend millions upon millions in research.
Were Black and brown people a part of this process, or was it only like white folks, like NASCAR white folks?
The trials were intentionally broad and inclusive.
Yeah, Black and brown folks have been recruited for the clinical trials.
We have ensured that each of the 4 historically Black medical schools, that we are all vaccine trial sites.
So here's the big question. How much are you charging us for this vaccine?
Right now, getting vaccinated is free.
Free?
Yes, it's free.
Like free.
It will be free.
Like not even free 99.
We have not charged anyone.
Okay, should I be suspicious that you aren't charging us?
No, because there are some things that the government invests in that for the good of the people.
Taxpayers like you and I contributed to the development of these vaccines.
What if I'm not worried about getting COVID-19?
Like you could say, I never had smallpox. I've never had tetanus. Why do I need the shot? That's why we give vaccines. Vaccines are prevention.
I pretty much tell people you're going to be exposed some kind of way, right? So you better be ready to fight.
And what about you? Have you? Will you?
I got my first dose about 3 weeks ago.
I have not gotten the vaccine yet, but rest assured, I'm anxiously waiting.
I definitely will be getting vaccinated when my turn comes.
I was scared getting it, and then after I got it, I was like, "Oh, well, I guess it wasn't that bad."
When the vaccine went in, I felt this intense amount of honor.
Like a lot of people, I like to get my medical information from bizarre, dark corners of the internet that haven't been vetted. Is that a good idea?
Oh, dear.
Please do not continue to do that.
That is definitely not a good idea.
Unfortunately, on the internet, pretty much anyone can post anything.
There are no microchips. There's no stealing of your DNA. No, none of that is happening.
Thank you, doctors. All right, I'll let you get back to work. And thank you for allowing me to ask you these questions. Oh, but before you go, just want to let you know, your parents are super proud of you. It's all they can talk about.
Okay, so just a video here from people who are in the profession, who look like us, who definitely know what they're talking about, and all of them are very much looking forward to getting the vaccine and are not sort of concerned about speed or microchips or anything. So when we talk about disinformation well, excuse me, let me back up. When we talk about information regarding the coronavirus, it's really important that we consult vetted sources. So the main two places that we use within the health department are the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, and the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which gives the approvals for vaccines and emergency use authorizations. A lot of what you're seeing on the internet, very unfortunately, comes from a very small number of people. I actually ran across a statistic once that showed that about 80% of the content that you see on Twitter, 80% is done by 10% of its users. So 80% of everything that you see on Twitter is only done by 10% of some of the loudest voices. And so what we've noticed is that a lot of some of the myths that come from the coronavirus come down to what we call the disinformation dozen. It's about 12 people who are kind of just ratcheting out all sorts of memes, incorrect Facebook posts, might be posting under different accounts. But once we trace them all to the source, it's about 12 people, and I'd be willing to bet that about 3 of them are Russian bots. So just to sort of wrap things up, here are some really, really important things that you need to know about the vaccine. They will keep you from getting sick, and people of color are particularly vulnerable against this virus, which is why it's so important that we sort of line up and get vaccinated. When we talk about vaccinations, especially with a larger group of people, we can get closer and closer to what we call herd immunity. That means that the virus is not spreading all that much at all, doesn't have the ability to mutate, and is effectively dead. Thankfully, we've been able to do this with smallpox, scarlet fever, MERS, and other diseases like that, is that if the virus doesn't spread, then it essentially isn't doing anything. A couple of other things just to note, some of the side effects are very, very mild and usually temporary. One of the things that I usually tell people is that if they have a severe reaction to a vaccine, which is not very likely, but say if they were, it would be that much worse had they actually gotten the virus, which is the disease. Because again, we're not injecting you with live virus when it comes to this vaccine. Another thing that's sort of come up in recent news is that women who are pregnant, breastfeeding, or even may become pregnant, this vaccine is safe for you and will not harm your baby. So thankfully, we were able to come up with the research for that. And most importantly, vaccines save lives, not just yours, but anybody that you could come in contact with that you're no longer infecting as a result of your vaccination. So it's really, really important that we kind of overcome this idea about vaccine hesitancy. Because especially in our communities, it's going to run much more rampant and become much more of a problem, because not only are we out there and exposed more, not only do we have the pre-existing conditions that sort of predispose us to a really severe reaction from the virus, it's a place where we want to be, where we're just kind of tamping down on all of that. If we don't have any virus spreading around, then we don't have any more infections, hence we have no more cases. Getting vaccinated, of course, is going to be a personal decision for everybody. So unfortunately, we're not able to sort of convince everybody. And there are some people who do have conditions where the vaccine would be dangerous. That's why it's that much more important for people who are eligible to get vaccinated to go ahead and do so to protect the people, especially those who can't get the vaccine. If you're taking the sort of wait and see approach, we've had about 70,000 people in clinical trials and over 100 million people across the world take the vaccine. And so I would hope that you have seen and that your waiting period is over. Let's see. And finally, we just have a couple of resources here, which we can make available later on. Just some resources from the CDC and also the FDA about information regarding the coronavirus. Thank you all so much for having me for this presentation. I would love to take some questions.
So I'm going to ask everyone so that we can have order. I want to ask you if you would use your reaction button down at the bottom of your screen and raise your hand so that we can take them in order. Derek, thank you so much. I want to ask you if we could also have a copy of this PowerPoint. Is it possible?
Of course.
Okay, thank you so very much. So those of you that have questions, if you would use the reaction buttons and raise your hand. Before you go, Elder Turner, I do have one question that was asked in the chat. That question was, Derek, how long does the vaccine remain on surfaces?
The virus?
Yes, how long does it remain on?
Virus. You said vaccine.
I said vaccine. I'm sorry, the virus. Forgive me.
Oh, you're fine.
I'm focused. The virus, please.
No, you're totally fine. I just wanted to make sure that I was answering the right question. So it really depends on the area and the amount of light that it's exposed to. So if we're talking about kind of like a park bench out in the middle of sun on a hot day, it's essentially 15 to 30 seconds and that virus is out of there. If we're talking about an indoor space that's much cooler, more sort of conducive conditions, then it can last about 15 to 30 minutes, if not exposed to any kind of light, disinfectant, or anything like that, which is part of the reason why we're really sounding alarm about hand washing in case you come into contact with those surfaces. But I would say that 90% of the transmission is usually done through water droplets from people speaking, singing, or it's pretty rare for you to get off of a surface.
Okay, so the first question, Elder Turner, you're first. Unmute your mic. We can hear you.
My question is concerning the Delta variants. I hear that it's very virulent, and I was wondering what's the difference between that and the original COVID-19 virus? What caused it to be more deadly?
Sure. So I'll just back up a little bit and talk about mutations for a sec. So viruses, when they jump to person, it's kind of like a game of, I don't know if any of you all have ever played the game telephone, where you kind of say a message and by the time it gets to the 10th person, you're dealing with something pretty different from what you originally said. The virus is very much this way. So every time it jumps from person to person, there's a little bit of something that gets changed. Usually it's not enough for us to register it as its own specific variant, but sometimes the shape of the virus, the way that the proteins sort of stack up on each other, the thickness of the outer shell, any of that stuff can change a little bit. And after a particular amount of change, then it develops into what we call a variant of the coronavirus. Different enough, but still in the same kind of family and species. When we're talking about the Delta variant, this one, the main difference is what's inside the virus and how quickly it can copy. It copies quite a lot faster than the original coronavirus, which is why it's so much more infectious. It's very likely that it's not any more, you're not more likely to experience symptoms as a result of getting the Delta variant. You're just a lot more likely to get the Delta variant. Because within the nose, where usually a lot of this virus is transferred, you have about 1,000 times more virus in the Delta variant than you would in, say, like the original. So the chances that you are able to kind of spread that disease around is that much more because you've got so much more virus in your system.
All right. Elder Sandra.
Okay, I have a two-part question. My first question is going back to something that you said about people who were infected and how long they should quarantine. Okay, I work at a school, and according to what the health department has said to us, if a child, I don't know why I'm getting feedback. Zoe, are you on Zoom? Okay, I don't know why I'm getting feedback. But anyway, the health department has said for children who come in contact with someone, they quarantine no longer for 10 days, but 8 days. And so if they still are positive, they stay out. But according to you, after so many days that they can return and they're not infectious anymore.
Sure, and that's a great question. And I would say there has been some confusion on this because as more research comes out, there's a little bit of an adjustment to the guidance. So when we're talking about an 8-day period, this is for somebody who has come into contact with somebody who was positive for the coronavirus and then is subsequently tested negative.
Mm-hmm.
And why we're saying 8 days is because very likely several days later they'll get another test before returning to school. And say like 8 days in, if you're not positive with the coronavirus, it's very unlikely for the virus to continue to build up in your system after that 8-day period. Now,
okay. Yeah. Sorry. The second part to that is this happened today. Okay. We had a student who was quarantined because he came in contact with another student who tested positive. He tested negative. He returned to school. The next day, another classmate came down with coronavirus. So the mother doesn't want him quarantined anymore because she's like, he was only there for that day. He was there 2 days, actually. He came back last Thursday, was there all day. And then on Friday, one of his classmates went home with COVID symptoms, and the dad called and said he does have COVID. So I'm calling the parent, and the mother doesn't want the same child quarantined twice.
Well, I would say that under those circumstances, I'm not sure about the specifics of that, but it sounds like that would all be covered under the same quarantine. So if you're quarantining for, say, the 8-day period that you described, and you come back after 2, that's not quarantining.
No. He stayed his 8 days from the first quarantine. But when he came back, there was a separate student, another incident. The first student was with the football team, and the second student was in his classroom.
I see. So under those circumstances, I would just recommend that he get a test because he is outside of that quarantine period. If he is a contact of somebody else, very likely that would start another investigation, but I think I would have to know a little bit more about that particular circumstance and maybe get in touch with the school nurse to kind of resolve any discrepancies there.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions? Is everything pretty clear? Pastor Kenneth, you have a question? I see your hand. Donnie, I see your hand too. Let's give Pastor Kenneth a chance, okay? Pastor Kenneth, did you want to say something? You want me to unmute you?
Okay. Can you all hear me?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Okay. I was reading about COVID. One of the things it said is that the COVID cannot do much unless it can get inside the cell, because that's where it wreaks havoc, inside the cell. I heard you say something about the vaccination prevents the COVID virus from being able to get inside of the cell. Is that what you said?
I wouldn't say necessarily that. However, very likely, what a vaccine would be able to do is to give you the ability to build up the antibodies which attack the virus. So it might be that it gets sort of lodged into a couple of cells here or there, but there are enough antibodies to kill it before it grows into an actual infection, such that we would be able to test for it.
So the vaccine is what gives the cells the ability to fight off the virus?
Kind of. So when we're talking about vaccines and we're talking antibodies, these things sort of exist outside of the cell. So if you can imagine, we kind of have sort of a little circular cell here. The virus kind of wants to infect. Before usually it's able to get to the cell, there's an antibody that comes in and attacks. Now that sort of thing exists outside of the cell, but it can also work within the cell as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay. Dontavia, you can unmute and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
My question, is the vaccine still under clinical trials? Like it hasn't been put through the FDA yet? I want to know if it's still on the clinical trials, because everything I research, it says still clinical trials, even though they're giving it out right now in the different, with the different vaccines.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. So the clinical trials are sort of a 3-trial period that happens before any drug company can go to the FDA and request any. So as far as the clinical trials themselves, they are done in a sense. However, we're still following up with them and monitoring their symptoms after the fact to get a sense of any kind of long-term effects, as scant of a chance as they are. So in a sense, yes, they're done, but they're also never going to be done because their monitoring of their symptoms is always going to be a sort of. Now, there are 2 types of approval processes that have kind of propagated out now. One is the emergency use authorization, which is something that's been granted to Pfizer, to Moderna, and also to the Johnson & Janssen vaccines. Now, when we talk about an emergency use, this isn't necessarily skipping steps in the clinical trial. It's saying we have a pretty good idea that this vaccine is going to be effective. We know that it's safe because of the 3 clinical trials. So because we're in an emergency situation, we're going to cut down a lot of the paperwork in order to get it out to the people who need it, because the risk of the vaccine is so low. These things are very, very rarely granted, and they're usually only granted when you have a giant health emergency at the same time that you have a vaccine that's very safe and effective. Now, the Pfizer biotech vaccine that you might have seen in the news has gained full authorization. So they are no longer under emergency use. I believe the vaccine now has some like terrible name like Comirnaty or something like that. Sounds like a Medea thing, but but yeah. So Pfizer has been fully approved, and the Moderna and the Johnson & Johnson are still under the emergency use authorization, although we do expect that to change soon as well.
All right. All right. We have a question from Elder Moore.
So I would say that the contact tracing is just as active as it's ever been. Unfortunately, what we're dealing with when we talk about, say, like this 4th wave of COVID is so many cases that to a certain extent, contact tracing has trouble keeping up. And so you can imagine that, say, if in the case where we had, say, maybe 300 to 400 people in Leon County testing positive in a day, it's very easy to call all of those people and then that much easier to get in with all of their contacts. Once that number goes up to 600, it's very likely that you have a lot more people who don't necessarily remember all the people that they've come in contact with. You're more likely to encounter people who don't necessarily want to share that information or talk to us. And so there's simply more and more people who slip through the cracks because our sample size is that much bigger. So we still do have a contact tracing team over the weekend. Sometimes I actually help out with them. Just to kind of keep my ear to the pulse of what's going on in the community. But that's not something that has stopped, and it's something that will definitely continue.
Okay. All right, Elder Turner and Deacon Turner.
Good.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
My question was concerning with the booster shot you mentioned. I understand that the Moderna booster shot will be coming out sometime this month, and getting that booster shot, does it speed up for those that have pre-existing condition? Because I heard you mention earlier an 8-month period, but if you got pre-existing condition, can you get it sooner?
Sure. So we've got essentially two sort of like categories of people right now when it comes to the booster shots. People who are very elderly, this is definitely people who are over the age of 85, might also include people who are over the age of 75, or people who have, say, a severe immunocompromise. So people who are HIV positive. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. Okay. So this would include people who are HIV positive, might have lupus, cancer, any other sort of thing that would generally weaken the immune system. We recommend that you get a booster shot, and those booster shots are available right now. When we talk larger public, that's when we get into sort of that 8-month scenario, is that once you're about 8 months from your second dose, we do recommend a booster shot to re-elevate those antibodies and make it more likely that your body develops what we call T cells, or sort of memorable antibodies, kind of like the elephant version of antibodies that never forget, so that when you come back into contact with the virus, then it has a pretty strong expeditiously.
Elder Turner, you still had a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask if you have a record. I don't remember if you said that, of people who may have been vaccinated that did get infected after having the vaccination, but they were still infected. Do you have a percentage of people that had gotten infected, and if there was a percentage of that who were severe, and maybe any of the reasons behind that?
Sure. So I would say that when we're talking about vaccines, what we're talking about are sort of chances that are reflected in percentages. So if we look at just say the Pfizer vaccine, for example, or the Moderna vaccine, which is very similar, it's about a 94% chance that even though you come in contact with the virus, that you won't be infected yourself. Now that still leaves about 5 to 6% chance that you will, which is why we get into some of the other categories of risks that we look at. Really, the main thing that we're trying to solve when it comes to the vaccine are severe illnesses and death. And thankfully, all of the vaccines, including the Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca, which I don't think is available yet, are very highly effective, well into sort of like the 99% of preventing people from getting the infection. Now, there are some people who will still show up in the hospital after having gotten the vaccine with the COVID-19 virus. Thankfully, that number is very small, and it's very reflective of a small percentage. But when we're talking about vaccinating a whole global population of about, say, like 7 billion people, then those people are going to sort of come up to the surface. As we're vaccinating so many people, those percentages get a little bit more overrepresented. Does that make sense?
Yeah, kind of. And I had just asked that because I had you know when people give the misinformation, and it was said that people were, and it wasn't being recorded like it should, of people who were being vaccinated but still coming in contact with the virus, and that was something that was happening, but it wasn't being people weren't being notified about that, like they are saying to get the vaccine. But when people were getting vaccine and then people were still getting infected, they were not reporting that kind of information. So I just wanted to ask that.
Sure. And I mean, and I would just add to that too, is that the mechanisms that we have for reporting kind of on an individual hospital level or at a doctor level are really such that it would take quite a large scale to keep those numbers kind of under wraps. And it sort of works against our interest too. If there are people who are getting vaccinated that are still dying from COVID, we want to know that so we can solve it. And we definitely want to know that so that we can keep other people from dying in the future and maybe might have an effect on the booster shot regimen that we end up giving. So this isn't necessarily information that we'd want to keep from the public. In fact, this is information that we'd want to know so that we can do our jobs as effectively as possible.
Excellent. Excellent. Donnie?
I honestly forgot my question in the midst of it all, but I do have a question about the scenario.
Okay.
If you think it goes back to tracking where, you know, someone contracted the virus. Just recently, I had a friend come over to my place on Saturday. Today, she messaged me and said her son has COVID. Her son was here Saturday. So if me, my boyfriend, and my boyfriend's daughter go get tested and we come back negative, is it still important to go get our daughter tested, who we didn't come in contact with until Monday, and then let people know who we came in contact with Monday, and the tree branch from there, like, go out if all three of us came back negative? I'm not sure.
Sure. So, I mean, what I would say is that just for certainty, I think it's important for everyone to get tested. Part of what we sort of were talking about before is that sort of infectious period before you have any symptoms. And so Monday necessarily wouldn't count, but if we're getting into, say, like Tuesday and Wednesday, and you are exposed to your daughter and you're still not sure if there's enough virus in your system to have you test positive on a test, then it's definitely a good idea probably to get a test now, and I would say 5 to 10 days from now.
Okay, because her son was, her son got it from the teacher at the daycare on Friday. So we came in contact with him on Saturday, but then we didn't come in contact with our daughter, some other friends, until Monday. So if all three of us come back negative, the people we came in contact with should still be tested?
Yes, we'd want to test everybody simply because some of the people in that group might be vaccinated. There could be a little bit of a time between when the virus builds up enough in your in your system versus when it's high enough to actually test positive on one of those swabs. So we would recommend that everybody who's been exposed to the virus get tested, if for no other reason, just to know that you don't have it and that you can sort of resume normal activity without any kind of fear.
Does that answer your question, Donnie?
Unfortunately, yes.
Sorry to be the bearer of that news. But yeah, so in those cases, we do recommend a quarantine of 8 days, unfortunately. Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Donnie. Elder Ward has a question, Derek.
Yes, Derek. I know you can't give any absolutes, but do you see an end to this?
Yes, only because the world is going to keep spinning. When we talk about an end to coronavirus, I think it's really important that we try to imagine what that looks like. So there was a time where, say, like the Black Plague was spreading around, and we didn't necessarily see an end in sight. And then the people back then discovered something way over in Europe. Oh my gosh, if we bathe and, don't poop in the streets, then the rats won't come and we won't get the virus. So, yeah, I mean, for no other reason than time persists on and statistics being a thing, we do see an endpoint to this. What I think is going to be a little bit different is how we define normal after all of this is done. Even before the coronavirus, they had many, many countries who were wearing masks, that were getting tested for just sort of diseases that are relatively random in America, but more common in those countries. And there's already kind of a heightened sense of the potential for infectious disease to go around the world. And so there are already protection measures to keep that from going into place. It could be the case that a lot of restaurants or sort of indoor spaces might just ask that you wear a mask from now on, or that it becomes part of the culture, or that maybe we don't necessarily shake hands as much and we kind of opt for the elbow bump. I think those things are a little bit less predictable, but as far as getting to the end of the emergency portion of this, I would say definitely there's an end in sight.
Okay. Good. Derek, I'm going to just make sure there aren't any other questions. I don't see any on Facebook. Elder Moore, do you have any waiting in the wings on Facebook or YouTube? Okay. All right. You have something else to say, Derek?
Yeah, I would just add, if anybody thinks of any other questions, I'd be happy to receive any emails from you all and answer any of those questions. This is sort of part of what I love to do, is making sure that everybody has the kind of information that they need in order to be able to best protect themselves. So I'm happy to answer those questions.
Okay, thank you so much. And I thank you for agreeing to send the PowerPoint. I want to thank everybody who is here and for you sharing it. And before we close, we're going to have comments from our pastor, both of our pastors, Pastor Kenneth, Pastor Alina. Do you all want to make some closing remarks before we close out? I'm gonna unmute you because I can't hear you. So let me unmute you or ask you to unmute.
All right.
No problem.
You hear us now, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
sir. We can hear both of you.
Thank you so much for this format where the information can be broken down and the misinformation and disinformation can be done away with, and we can replace it with that which is already cleaned up. It's come through the laundry and it's clean information. Thank you, Brother Derek. I haven't met you, but it is good to have you in our midst. We're happy to have you here and look forward to you coming again. I'm sure more questions, more people, more curiosity. There will be more as we move along to the next session and the one after there. I'm thankful and grateful to God that all of you are still here. Hold on.
Derek, I want to say thank you for the presentation tonight. I would like to ask one question in lieu of where we are. This is football season, and I'm very concerned about seeing all of these folk packed into the stadiums, and most of the stadium. I watched all of these games, and most of them I saw no mask on anybody. And so we got a game at home, and what would be the recommendation about that if folk gonna go to the game and that kind of thing? Because they're not social distancing, they talking about full capacity and that kind of thing.
So what I would say about really football games, or really kind of any other activity, is that one of the things that I find at least encouraging to myself is that I'm armed with as much information as possible. So for me, if I know exactly how the virus spreads, I know exactly what vaccinations do, I know my level of risk, then people can, and some unfortunately do, make the decision to go into crowded spaces, even though they haven't necessarily taken any of those preventive measures to keep themselves from getting sick. With anything, I would say, whether it's going to the grocery store or office, or certainly a football game where there's a lot of unmasked people in large sort of crowded spaces, is that is a place where the virus can potentially spread. One interesting statistic that I came across over in South Carolina, if you're vaccinated, unfortunately, because of the level of spread that's going on there and the amount that people are being exposed to the coronavirus, they are just as likely as someone who's in New York who is vaccinated to get the coronavirus. So, unvaccinated person in South Carolina, or excuse me, a vaccinated person in South Carolina just as likely as an unvaccinated person in New York. And the biggest reason for that is that there's not a whole lot of spread going on in that state because so many people are vaccinated, which gets us closer to that herd immunity that we were talking about, where the virus isn't spreading enough to be a danger to anybody. So in those cases, I would just say, know your risk and please get tested afterwards just to make sure that you're not spreading this around to other people.
Good. That's good.
Thank you.
Thank you all for having me here. It's been an absolute pleasure being here, and you all are a wonderful group of people to be able to talk to, and I really appreciate all of your questions. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. We
Bless you.
appreciate you. We'll be in contact.
Okay, sounds great. Y'all have a great night.
Yeah. Yes, you too.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Take care, you all.
Take care.
You too.
Thank you, Metro family.
All right, lady.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, all. Stay well, sleep well.
Record.